Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight's story begins not in an old house, an abandoned hospital, or a remote forest. Instead, it begins in an ordinary room with a small group of people seated around a table. They were not investigating a haunted place. They were not searching for a ghost that already existed. In fact, they were attempting something far stranger. The group planned to create a ghost entirely from imagination. The experiment took place in Canada during the early 1970s. A number of ordinary people gathered together with a simple but unusual goal. They would invent a fictional man, give him a history, a personality, and a life story, and then try to contact him as though he were real. The imaginary man they created was called Philip. At first, the idea may have sounded more like an exercise in creativity than an attempt at the paranormal. The participants themselves were not all believers in ghosts. Some were curious, some were skeptical, and others simply wanted to see what might happen. Yet, as the experiment continued, the group began to report strange experiences. There were knocks on the table, movements in the room, and what seemed to be responses to questions. Gradually, the line between imagination and reality appeared to become less clear. What made the story especially unusual was that Philip had never existed. The group had invented him completely. His name, his history, and even the details of his life had been created from nothing. And yet, according to the people in the room, something seemed to answer. For some, the Philip experiment became evidence that the human mind may be capable of creating experiences that feel real in ways we do not fully understand. For others, it became one of the most unusual and unsettling paranormal stories of the 20th century. As always, if you enjoy these calm and thoughtful documentaries, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps support more long-form stories told in a quiet and gentle way. Now, settle in, let the day slowly fade into the background, and join me as we explore the strange story of the Philip experiment and the ghost that may have been imagined into existence. The origins of the Philip experiment can be traced back to the early 1970s in Toronto, where a small group of people became interested in a simple but unusual question. Could a ghost be created through imagination alone? The question emerged from the work of the Toronto Society for Psychical Research, a group formed by individuals interested in psychology, parapsychology, and unexplained experiences. Unlike some paranormal organizations, the members of the society did not begin with a strong belief in ghosts or supernatural forces. Instead, they approached such subjects with curiosity and a desire to explore whether unusual experiences could be studied in a structured way. One of the people involved was A.R.G. Owen, a mathematician and researcher who had become interested in reports of séances and other paranormal phenomena. Owen believed that many ghost stories and séance experiences might not be caused by actual spirits. Instead, he wondered whether the human mind itself could somehow create these experiences. This idea was influenced by earlier theories in psychology and psychical research. Some researchers had suggested that the expectations, beliefs, and emotions of a group could sometimes lead to unusual experiences, especially when people gathered together in a focused and emotional setting. Owen wanted to test this idea directly. Rather than searching for a real historical ghost, he proposed something different. A group of people would invent a fictional character and then attempt to contact that character during séances. If nothing happened, the experiment would suggest that ghostly experiences required an actual spirit or external force. But if something did happen, it might mean that the group had created the experience themselves. The idea attracted several volunteers. Most of them had no previous experience with paranormal investigations. In fact, many members of the group described themselves as ordinary people with jobs and families. Some believed in paranormal phenomena, while others remained skeptical. This mixture of personalities was important because the experiment was intended to avoid the influence of a single, strong believer. Instead, the group wanted to see whether a shared idea alone could produce results. The participants agreed that before beginning any séances, they would first create a detailed fictional person. They would give him a name, a life story, a personality, and even a reason why he might now exist as a ghost. Only after they had built this imaginary figure in great detail would they begin trying to contact him. The fictional ghost they created would eventually become known as Philip. At the time, none of the participants expected what would happen next. The experiment seemed unusual, but still fairly simple. Yet, over the months that followed, the small group in Toronto would begin to experience events that they themselves found difficult to explain. What began as an idea about imagination would gradually become one of the most famous and unusual experiments in paranormal history. After the idea for the experiment had been developed by the Toronto Society for Psychical Research, a small group of volunteers was brought together in Toronto to take part. The group consisted of around 8 ordinary people. They were not professional mediums, paranormal investigators, or spiritual leaders. Most had ordinary jobs and little experience with séances or ghost stories. This was an important part of the experiment. The researchers wanted to avoid using anyone who already claimed to have psychic abilities. They believed that if strange events occurred, it would be more meaningful if the group consisted of people with no special experience. Among the participants were an accountant, a bookkeeper, a housewife, a student, and several others with everyday backgrounds. Some members were interested in psychology and unusual experiences, while others joined simply out of curiosity. The group met regularly over a period of many months. At first, the meetings were calm and almost academic in nature. The participants sat together, discussed ideas, and planned the details of the experiment. Although some of them were open to the possibility that something unusual might happen, others remained doubtful. Several members said openly that they did not believe they would ever experience anything supernatural. This mixture of belief and skepticism created an unusual atmosphere within the group. Nobody knew exactly what to expect. The meetings took place under the guidance of Arg Owen and his wife, Iris Owen. Together, they helped organize the experiment and encouraged the participants to focus closely on the fictional ghost they were about to create. Before any attempt was made to contact Philip, the group spent weeks discussing him in detail. They wanted everyone to share the same clear image of who he was. This process was important because the experiment depended on the idea that a strong and detailed shared belief might somehow produce results. The participants were encouraged to think about Philip as though he had once been a real person. They talked about his appearance, his background, his emotions, and the events of his imagined life. As the weeks passed, the members of the group became increasingly familiar with this fictional man. They spoke about him regularly and even joked about him at times. Slowly, Philip began to feel less like an invented character and more like someone the group knew. The atmosphere in the meetings also began to change. At first, the sessions had been formal and careful, but as the participants grew more comfortable, the meetings became warmer and more relaxed. The group laughed together, shared ideas, and developed a sense of friendship. This closeness may have played an important role in what happened later. Psychologists have often noted that strong emotions and a shared sense of purpose can influence the way people experience unusual situations. By spending so much time together and focusing on the same idea, the participants may have created an environment where their expectations became stronger and stronger. Yet at this stage, nothing unusual had happened. There were no strange sounds, no movements, and no signs of any ghostly presence. The group was still only a group of ordinary people sitting together in a room, discussing a person who had never existed. Soon, however, they would begin creating Philip himself, and the details they gave him would become the foundation of everything that followed. Once the group had become familiar with one another, the next stage of the experiment began. Together, they started to create the fictional man who would become known as Philip. The participants wanted Philip to feel like a complete person, rather than a vague idea. They believed that if they were going to imagine him into existence, they needed to know every detail of his life. Over several meetings, they slowly built a story around him. The group decided that Philip would have lived in 17th century England. They imagined him as an aristocratic man, well-educated and respected, living during a time of political conflict and social change. They gave him the full name Philip Aylesford, according to the story they created. Philip had been born in the year 1624. He was described as a wealthy nobleman with dark hair, serious features, and a somewhat reserved personality. The group imagined him living in a large house in the English countryside. They pictured him wearing the clothing of the period and moving through a world of stone halls, candlelight, and long evenings beside the fire. To make Philip seem more believable, the participants added many small details to his life. They decided that he had supported the king during the English Civil War. They imagined him as a loyal and traditional man who had strong opinions and a sense of duty. At the same time, they gave him personal weaknesses and regrets. Philip, according to the story, had married a woman named Dorothea. The marriage was not a happy one. Dorothea was described as cold, distant, and difficult to live with. Later, Philip supposedly fell in love with another woman named Margot. Unlike his wife, Margot was imagined as kind, gentle, and warm. The participants developed the story further. They imagined that Philip and Margot had fallen deeply in love, but that their relationship had to remain secret. Eventually, according to the fictional history, Dorothea discovered the affair. Margot was accused of witchcraft, a dangerous accusation during that period. The group imagined that she was put on trial and later executed. Philip, devastated by what had happened, was said to have fallen into despair. In the story, he wandered alone for some time before finally taking his own life. The group believed that this tragic ending would give Philip a reason to remain as a ghost. By the end of these meetings, Philip's life had become remarkably detailed. The participants had created his appearance, his family, his home, his emotions, and even the painful events that had supposedly led to his death. Some members of the group later said that they began to picture him clearly in their minds. They could imagine his face, his voice, and the sadness that seemed to surround him. Yet there was still one important fact that everyone understood. Philip had never existed. No historical records mentioned him. No old house had ever belonged to him. The entire story had been invented by the group sitting in that room. And yet, as they continued to think about him and speak about him, Philip began to feel strangely real. By the time the group was ready to begin their séances, they no longer felt as though they were attempting to contact an imaginary character. Instead, many of them felt as though they were preparing to meet someone they already knew. As the members of the group continued to develop Philip Aylesford, they decided that it was not enough to give him only a name and a tragic life story. If the experiment was going to work, they believed that Philip needed a personality. The participants began to discuss what kind of man Philip would have been if he had truly lived. They imagined him as intelligent, thoughtful, and quiet. He was described as someone who often kept his feelings hidden beneath a calm and serious appearance. Although Philip belonged to a wealthy and respected family, the group believed that he was never entirely comfortable with the life expected of him. They imagined that he often felt trapped by his position and by the responsibilities placed upon him. The members of the experiment also decided that Philip would not have been especially confident. Beneath his formal and noble appearance, they imagined a man who was uncertain and often lonely. This detail became important because it made Philip seem more human. Rather than inventing a perfect or heroic figure, the group created someone with flaws, fears, and regrets. They imagined that Philip had loved music, enjoyed riding through the countryside, and preferred quiet evenings to large social gatherings. He was said to be polite and respectful, but also shy and sometimes withdrawn. The group even discussed the kinds of things Philip might dislike. They imagined that he would not enjoy loud arguments, dishonesty, or people who tried to control others. By building these details, the participants slowly created the sense that Philip had his own opinions and emotions. The group also imagined the emotional effect that the death of Margot had upon him. They believed that losing her had left Philip full of guilt and sorrow. According to the story, Philip blamed himself for what had happened. He believed that he had failed to protect the person he loved. This imagined guilt became a central part of his personality. The group pictured Philip as a man whose sadness followed him even after death. At times during the meetings, the participants spoke about Philip almost as though he were present in the room. They would ask themselves what he might think about certain subjects, or how he might react to different situations. Sometimes the group disagreed. One person might imagine Philip as calm and gentle, while another pictured him as more serious or distant. These discussions often lasted for hours. Eventually, the group reached a shared understanding of who Philip was. By this point, Philip had become more than a character in a story. He had become a detailed personality created by the combined imagination of everyone in the room. The participants also decided upon certain facts that would remain fixed. Philip, they agreed, would always be honest. He would never intentionally frighten anyone. He would not be cruel or violent. Instead, they imagined that if Philip ever appeared, he would be quiet, thoughtful, and perhaps even a little shy. This choice later shaped the way the group interpreted the strange events that followed, when unusual sounds or movements began to occur. The participants often believed that they matched the personality they had given to Philip. A gentle knock might be understood as a polite answer. A pause might be interpreted as hesitation. The group slowly began to believe that the imaginary man they had created was responding in exactly the way they expected him to. Whether these experiences came from the mind, from suggestion, or from something the group could not explain, Philip had by now become very real to the people sitting around the table. After months of building Philip's story and personality, the group finally began the part of the experiment that had interested them from the beginning. They arranged a series of séances and attempted to contact the fictional man they had created. At first, the meetings followed the traditional style of a séance. The participants sat quietly around a table in a dimly lit room. They closed their eyes, concentrated on Philip, and waited. The room was silent except for the sound of breathing, chairs shifting slightly, and the occasional movement of someone adjusting their hands on the table. The group spent many evenings in this way. During the early sessions, nothing happened. There were no mysterious knocks, no sudden movements, and no sign that Philip was present. The participants simply sat together in silence, thinking about a man who did not exist. For some members of the group, this result seemed exactly what they had expected. A few began to wonder whether the entire experiment had been a mistake. After all, they had invented Philip themselves. It seemed difficult to believe that an imaginary person could somehow begin to answer them. Yet the group did not stop. Instead, they continued meeting week after week. The participants remained patient and kept returning to the same room, bringing with them the image of Philip they had created together. They often spoke about him before the séances began. They would discuss his life, his personality, and the details of his imagined past. Sometimes they even looked at drawings or notes they had made about him. The researchers believed that the group needed to become as familiar with Philip as possible. The more clearly they could imagine him, the more likely the experiment might be to produce results. Even so, the atmosphere during these early sessions remained calm and quiet. There was no fear in the room. The participants were curious, but most still felt that they were simply taking part in an unusual psychological experiment. As the weeks passed, however, the group noticed that the traditional séance style did not seem to help. Sitting silently in darkness appeared to create only more silence. Eventually, the researchers decided to change their approach. Instead of remaining quiet and serious, the group would try something more relaxed. They moved the meetings into a brighter room. The lights were left on, and the atmosphere became more casual. The participants no longer sat in complete silence. They talked to one another, laughed, and spoke directly to Philip as though he were present. Some members later said that the meetings began to feel more like a social gathering than a séance. The group even placed their hands lightly on the table and encouraged Philip to respond if he was somehow there. At first, there was still nothing. Then, after many months of patience and repetition, the silence finally began to change. One evening, as the group sat together speaking casually, a faint sound came from the table. It was only a single knock. The participants stopped speaking and looked at one another. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then someone asked quietly whether Philip had made the sound. A second knock followed. The room became completely silent once again, but this time, the silence felt very different from before. The single knock that ended one of the early meetings changed the atmosphere of the experiment completely. Until that moment, the group had spent months speaking to Philip without receiving any reply. Now, for the first time, there seemed to be some kind of response. At first, the participants remained cautious. They knew that a table could make small sounds naturally. A chair shifting against the floor, or a hand resting too heavily on the wood, might easily explain what they had heard. Even so, they decided to continue. One member of the group asked a simple question. If Philip was present, they asked, could he knock once for yes and twice for no? A moment later, there was a single knock from beneath the table. The group repeated the question several times. Each time, the sound seemed to answer correctly. When they asked whether Philip had lived in England, there was one knock. When they asked whether he had been a sailor, there were two. The answers matched the story they had created for him. As the meetings continued, the knocks became more regular. Sometimes they came from the table itself. At other times they seemed to come from the walls or floor nearby. The sounds were never especially loud, but they were clear enough that everyone in the room could hear them. The participants slowly began to ask more detailed questions. They asked about Philip's imagined life, his home, and the people they had invented around him. Once again, the knocks appeared to respond in ways that fit the character they had created. What made the experience especially strange was that Philip occasionally seemed to answer in ways that surprised the group. On some evenings, the knocks came before the question had been fully asked. At other times, the table seemed to move slightly beneath their hands. The movements were small in the beginning. The table would tremble gently or shift by only a fraction. Yet even these small movements felt remarkable to the people sitting around it. The group later described the atmosphere in the room as changing gradually over time. The meetings no longer felt like an experiment taking place among strangers. Instead, it began to seem as though another presence had joined them. Several participants said they developed a habit of speaking to Philip as though he was sitting nearby. They greeted him at the beginning of the evening and sometimes joked with him during the sessions. To their surprise, the knocks often seemed to respond differently depending on the mood in the room. If the group laughed, the table sometimes moved more quickly or more strongly. If the atmosphere became too serious, the sounds often stopped. Because of this, the participants began treating Philip less like a ghost from a tragic story, and more like a familiar companion. Over time, the table movements became stronger. On some evenings, witnesses claimed that one side of the table rose slightly from the floor. On other occasions, it appeared to tilt or move across the room. The group insisted that nobody was pushing it. The sessions took place in a brightly lit room, and everyone could see one another clearly. This made the events feel even more unusual. Eventually, the participants developed a simple system of communication. 1 knock meant yes. 2 knocks meant no. A series of knocks might represent letters or numbers. Using this method, the group held what they believed were conversations with Philip. The answers were usually simple, but they often matched the personality and history the group had invented months earlier. Yet there was one detail that many people later found unsettling. Whenever the participants asked Philip about things outside the fictional story they had created, the responses usually stopped. Philip could answer questions about his imagined life because the group had already decided what those answers should be. But when asked about real history, unfamiliar facts, or anything the group did not know, there was often only silence. For some observers, this suggested that the strange events might have come from the minds of the participants themselves. Others believed the experiment had somehow created something independent that was limited by the story given to it. Whatever the explanation may have been, by this point the group no longer felt they were sitting around an ordinary table in an ordinary room. Something had changed, and the experiment had become far stranger than anyone expected. As the months passed, the members of the group found themselves becoming more deeply involved in the experiment than they had expected. What had begun as an unusual idea was slowly becoming something that felt increasingly real. The knocks and movements continued during nearly every meeting. By now, the participants had become so used to Philip's presence that they often spoke to him naturally, almost as though another person had joined the group. When the members arrived for the evening, they sometimes greeted Philip aloud. They would ask if he was there, and often the table would answer with a single knock. This simple pattern, repeated again and again over many weeks, had a powerful effect on the group. The members began to feel that Philip had developed a personality separate from the story they had originally invented. Although they had imagined him as shy and quiet, the group now described him as friendly, playful, and sometimes even humorous. On certain evenings, the table would knock repeatedly when the group laughed, as though Philip was enjoying the conversation. Several members later said that the experience no longer felt like a game or an experiment. Instead, it felt as though they had come to know someone. The atmosphere of the sessions became increasingly emotional. Some participants admitted that they felt disappointed when nothing happened. Others said they looked forward to the meetings and thought about Philip during the week. The more time they spent together, the stronger the sense of belief became. Eventually, the group decided to ask Philip questions that had not been part of the original story. They wanted to see whether he could provide information beyond what they had imagined. The results were limited. When asked questions about his invented past, Philip answered clearly through the system of knocks. But when the group asked him about real historical events or facts they themselves did not know, the responses became confused or stopped altogether. For example, when they asked Philip about details of 17th century England that none of the participants knew, there was often no answer. Sometimes the knocks became uncertain or contradictory. This was important because it suggested that Philip could only respond within the limits of the knowledge already held by the group. Even so, this did not weaken the belief of the participants. In some ways, it made the experience seem even more mysterious. Several members said that they no longer cared whether Philip was truly a ghost in the traditional sense. Whether he was a spirit, a product of the mind, or something in between, he still felt real to them. The group also noticed that the sessions seemed to work best when everyone was relaxed and emotionally connected. If a new person joined the room, or if someone became too serious or skeptical, the strange activity often decreased. On the other hand, when the atmosphere was warm and friendly, the table seemed to respond more quickly. By now, Philip had become well known within the small circle of people connected to the experiment. Visitors sometimes attended the sessions to observe what was happening. To the surprise of many witnesses, the knocks and movements often continued, even when strangers were present. This gave the experiment a greater sense of reality. The participants no longer felt that the strange events existed only in their own imagination. Some visitors left the meetings convinced that they had witnessed something paranormal. Others believed they had seen an example of how powerful suggestion and expectation can be. Meanwhile, the members of the group continued to feel that Philip had become more than the fictional man they had first imagined in a room in Toronto. The line between invention and reality had become increasingly difficult to see. Philip still had no true history, no grave, and no life beyond the story the group had written for him. Yet to the people sitting around that table, he no longer felt imaginary at all. As reports of the Philip experiment began to spread, many people tried to explain what had happened in the room in Toronto. Some believed that the group had discovered evidence of something paranormal. Others believed the experiment could be explained through psychology. One of the most common explanations involved a process known as the ideomotor effect. The ideomotor effect is the tendency for people to make small physical movements without realizing they are doing so. These movements are often guided by thoughts, expectations, or emotions. A familiar example can be seen in the use of Ouija boards. Participants may believe that the pointer is moving by itself, when in fact each person is making tiny unconscious movements that gradually guide it across the board. Some psychologists suggested that the same thing may have happened during the Philip experiment. The members of the group spent months imagining Philip in great detail. They thought about him regularly, spoke about him often, and expected him to respond. Because of this, the participants may have unconsciously caused the table to move or produce small sounds. Since everyone in the room shared the same expectations, even very small movements could have been enough to create the impression that Philip was communicating. The atmosphere of the meetings may also have played an important role. The group met repeatedly in the same room and spent many hours together. Over time, they became close friends. They shared the same goal and slowly developed a common belief that something unusual might happen. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a form of group suggestion. When people spend time together and focus strongly on the same idea, they may begin to influence one another without realizing it. In the Philip experiment, every member of the group expected Philip to behave in a certain way. They believed he would be polite, quiet, and somewhat shy. As a result, when the table knocked softly or moved gently, the participants interpreted the experience as fitting the personality they had given to Philip. The fact that Philip could not answer questions outside the story created by the group also seemed important to many researchers. Whenever the participants asked about details they themselves did not know, the responses often stopped. Philip seemed able to answer only within the limits of the information already present in the minds of the people in the room. To many observers, this suggested that the source of the experience was not an independent ghost, but the imagination and expectations of the group itself. However, not everyone accepted this explanation. Some paranormal researchers argued that the Philip experiment may have revealed a different kind of phenomenon. They suggested that the group could have created a type of thought form, sometimes known in spiritual traditions as a tulpa. A tulpa is believed to be an entity created through strong concentration and belief. According to this idea, a group of people focusing intensely on the same image might somehow bring that image into existence. This concept has appeared in different cultures for many years. In some traditions, it is believed that thoughts, if repeated often enough and with enough emotion, can take on a life of their own. Supporters of this theory pointed out that Philip seemed to develop beyond the simple story the group had invented. They believed that his personality had become more independent as the experiment continued. Yet even those who supported paranormal explanations often admitted that there was no clear proof of what had happened. The experiment was never able to show that Philip existed outside the room or beyond the people who believed in him. In the end, the Philip experiment remained difficult to explain. It stood somewhere between psychology and the paranormal, between imagination and experience. What made it so memorable was not simply the knocks or the moving table. It was the unsettling possibility that a group of ordinary people, sitting quietly together, may have created something that felt completely real. After the apparent success of the Philip experiment, the members of the Toronto Society for Psychical Research began to wonder whether the results could be repeated. If Philip had been created through imagination and shared belief, perhaps other fictional ghosts could be created in the same way. To test this idea, the researchers organized several new experiments. Each involved a different group of people and a different invented character. The purpose was simple. If the strange knocks and movements happened again, it would suggest that the original experiment with Philip had not been a coincidence. One of the best-known follow-up experiments involved a fictional woman named Lilith. Like Philip, Lilith was entirely imaginary. The new group created her story in detail before attempting any séance. They decided that Lilith would be very different from Philip. While Philip had been imagined as gentle and thoughtful, Lilith was described as restless, emotional, and unpredictable. The participants gave her a complicated and sometimes troubled history. They imagined that she had lived a difficult life and carried feelings of anger and sadness. The group believed that if their theory was correct, the character they created might influence the type of strange experiences that followed. Once again, the participants met regularly in a room and spent weeks discussing their imaginary figure. They learned everything they could about Lilith's fictional life and tried to picture her as clearly as possible. Then they began their séances. According to those who took part, unusual events soon began to happen. There were knocks, movements, and responses that seemed similar to those reported during the Philip experiment. However, the participants believed that the atmosphere felt noticeably different. Where Philip had seemed calm and polite, Lilith appeared to respond in a more energetic and unpredictable way. The tables sometimes moved more quickly. The knocks seemed louder and less regular. Several participants later said that the sessions felt more tense than the meetings with Philip. To those involved in the research, this appeared significant. They believed that the personality of the fictional character was affecting the nature of the experience. The researchers later repeated the process with other imaginary figures. One experiment involved a ghost called Sebastian. Another used a fictional medieval alchemist. In each case, the pattern was remarkably similar. The group would spend time creating the character, building a shared belief, and then gathering together in a séance setting. Soon afterward, they would begin reporting knocks, movements, and what seemed to be communication. To supporters of the experiments, these repeated results seemed to suggest that the phenomenon was real in some form. Perhaps, they argued, the mind was capable of creating experiences more powerful than anyone had realized. Others remained skeptical. Psychologists pointed out that every new group had already heard about the Philip experiment before beginning. Because of this, the participants may have entered the séances expecting strange things to happen. If they already believed that knocks and table movements were possible, they may have been more likely to notice small sounds and interpret them as meaningful. The fact that each group created a different kind of ghost may also have influenced the way they interpreted the events. If they expected Lilith to seem emotional and unpredictable, they might naturally view every movement of the table in that way. In other words, the experiments may have reflected the beliefs of the participants rather than the existence of any ghost. Even so, the later experiments added another layer to the mystery. They showed that the strange experiences of the Philip group were not entirely unique. Again and again, different groups of ordinary people appeared to create the same kind of experience simply by sharing a story and believing in it strongly enough. Whether this revealed the power of imagination, the effect of suggestion, or something stranger. The experiments with Lilith and the other fictional ghosts ensured that the mystery of Philip would not be forgotten. As interest in the Philip experiment spread, psychologists, researchers, and skeptical observers began to examine the events more closely. While many people found the story fascinating, not everyone believed that a ghost had been created. To many observers, the experiment seemed less like evidence of the supernatural and more like an example of how powerful the human mind can be. One of the strongest criticisms came from those who believed that the participants had influenced one another without realizing it. The members of the group spent many months together in the same room. They discussed Philip repeatedly, shared their expectations, and gradually became emotionally connected to the idea that something might happen. When people spend enough time in a close group, they often begin to respond in similar ways. They may notice the same details, interpret events in the same manner, and influence one another without intending to. This process is sometimes called social suggestion. In the Philip experiment, every participant already knew the story of Philip. They knew what sort of person he was meant to be, what answers he should give, and how he might behave. Because of this, even small sounds or movements could easily take on a larger meaning. A quiet knock from the table might normally be ignored, but in the atmosphere of the séance, it became a message. A slight movement of the table might usually seem unimportant. Yet after months of focusing on Philip, the group saw it as a sign that he was present. Psychologists have pointed out that people do not simply observe the world around them. They also interpret it through their beliefs and expectations. If a person strongly expects something to happen, the mind may become more likely to notice events that support that expectation. The Philip experiment may therefore have been an example of suggestion becoming so powerful that it created an experience that felt completely real. Researchers also noted that the participants never received information that they did not already know. Whenever Philip was asked about real history or unfamiliar facts, the answers usually disappeared or became confused. The responses always remained within the limits of the story that the group had invented. To skeptics, this was perhaps the clearest sign that the experiment reflected the minds of the participants, rather than the presence of an actual ghost. Another important factor may have been the emotional atmosphere of the meetings. The group often described the sessions as warm, relaxed, and enjoyable. They laughed together, spoke openly, and formed close friendships. This emotional connection may have made the experience more convincing. When people feel safe and connected, they may become more willing to share unusual thoughts and accept unusual experiences. The room itself may also have played a role. The meetings often lasted for hours. The participants sat closely together, concentrating on the same ideas in the same environment. Under those conditions, even ordinary sounds and movements can begin to seem unusual. Yet despite all these possible explanations, many people still find the Philip experiment difficult to dismiss completely. The strange events happened repeatedly over a long period of time. They occurred in front of visitors and were even recorded on film. Although the footage does not prove that Philip existed, it does show the group reacting to something they clearly believed was real. Perhaps that is what continues to make the experiment so memorable. It forces people to consider an uncomfortable possibility. What if the mind is capable of creating experiences far more vivid and powerful than we normally imagine? The Philip experiment may not have proved the existence of ghosts, but it may have revealed something equally mysterious about belief, expectation, and the hidden power of the human mind. More than 50 years after it first took place, the Philip experiment continues to attract attention. It remains one of the most unusual and memorable stories in the history of paranormal research. Part of the reason is that the experiment sits in a place between two very different possibilities. On one side is the idea that the events were caused entirely by psychology. On the other is the possibility that something truly unexplained happened in that room in Toronto. Neither explanation has ever completely replaced the other. For people who are interested in ghosts and the paranormal, the Philip experiment offers an unusual kind of mystery. Most ghost stories begin with a person who supposedly once lived and died. Philip was different because he had never existed at all. The group invented him from nothing. They gave him a face, a voice, and a life story. Then, somehow, they began to feel that he was answering them. This idea has remained deeply unsettling for many people. If the experiment was real in some sense, it suggests that the mind may be capable of creating something far more powerful than imagination alone. It raises the possibility that thoughts, emotions, and shared belief can shape experience in ways we do not yet understand. Even people who reject paranormal explanations often find the experiment fascinating. To psychologists, the story offers a remarkable example of how human beings can influence one another. It shows how expectation, suggestion, and repeated belief can create experiences that feel completely convincing. The Philip experiment is often discussed in studies of group psychology, memory, and belief. It is used as an example of how people can come to share an experience, even when there may be no external cause. In this sense, the experiment is not simply a ghost story. It is also a story about the human mind. Over the years, the Philip experiment has appeared in books, documentaries, television programs, and discussions about the paranormal. It has inspired other experiments and encouraged many people to ask similar questions. What happens when enough people believe in the same thing? Can an idea become so strong that it begins to feel real? And where is the line between imagination and experience? These questions continue to interest people because there are no easy answers. Modern audiences may also find the story strangely familiar. Today, people often gather around shared ideas, stories, and beliefs. Sometimes those ideas become powerful enough to shape the way people see the world. The Philip experiment can therefore seem less like an unusual event from the 1970s and more like a reminder of something that still happens today. The mind has always had the ability to create powerful stories. Sometimes those stories remain only in our thoughts. At other times, they begin to influence the world around us. Whether Philip was only a product of suggestion or something stranger, his story has survived for decades because it touches on a fear that many people recognize. The fear that perhaps the things we imagine are not always as imaginary as we believe. By the end of the experiment, there was still no proof that Philip existed outside the minds of the group. No photograph ever showed him. No voice was ever recorded. No independent evidence was found. And yet, for the people who sat around that table, Philip remained real. Perhaps that is why the experiment is remembered so clearly. Not because it proved the existence of ghosts, but because it revealed how thin the distance may be between a story and a belief, between an idea and an experience. And perhaps, somewhere in that quiet space between the two, Philip still waits. As tonight's story comes to an end, the room in Toronto grows quiet once again. The table is still, the voices of the participants have faded, and the imaginary man they created returns to silence. Whether Philip was only a shared idea or something more, the experiment leaves behind a curious feeling. It reminds us that the mind is not always as simple or predictable as it seems. We like to believe that imagination and reality are clearly separated. We imagine one to be solid and certain, and the other to belong only to dreams and stories. Yet the Philip experiment suggests that the line between them may sometimes be much softer than we expect. Perhaps the participants never created a ghost at all. Perhaps they only discovered how powerful belief can become when people share it together. A thought repeated often enough, in the same room, with the same people, can slowly begin to feel real. At the same time, there remains something quietly unsettling about the experiment. The group did not simply tell a story about Philip. They began to react to him, speak to him, and wait for him as though he were truly there. In the end, what matters most may not be whether Philip existed in the traditional sense. What matters is that the experience felt real to the people who lived through it. And perhaps that is why the story continues to stay with so many people long after it is over. Tonight, as the room around you becomes quieter and the day slowly drifts away, you may find yourself thinking about the strange power of imagination. You may think about how easily the mind fills empty spaces, how quickly a story can take shape, and how difficult it can sometimes be to let it go. For now, though, there is no need to solve the mystery. You can simply leave Philip where he began, in a quiet room, around an old table, among a group of ordinary people who wondered what might happen if they imagined someone strongly enough. Thank you for spending this time here tonight. If you enjoyed this calm journey into one of the strangest stories in paranormal history, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And now, as the night grows a little deeper and your thoughts begin to settle, you can let the story fade gently into the distance. Good night.